Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to The Hope Within on this Wednesday afternoon. My name is William Hemsworth. I thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Well, at The Hope Within, we get our name from 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." So, a couple of housekeeping items real quick. Last week on KKMC, a replay was played of the show. That's because I had a really bad cold. I was losing my voice pretty intermittently. I'm still not fully healed, and if you hear some coughing over the course of the show, that's kind of what that's about. So my apologies in advance. I'm going to do my best to get through today's show. But today's show, we're going to talk about Bible translation. So we have a question that came in from a listener, Andrew, in Phoenix, Arizona, actually. He wrote in and he asked, he's familiar with the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts of the Bible, and he's familiar with how it was translated into Latin early on in the church. He wants to know if there were any earlier translations of the scriptures, and if so, what are the influences of those translations, not only on translation today, but on spreading the gospel message as well. And so to answer Andrew's question, what I want to do is look at the history of Bible translation from 100 to 500 AD, and of course this is going to be a general overview. But I think it'll get to the heart of Andrew's question and give us some knowledge going forth about how God has preserved His Word, how it's been preserved in such a way for us to benefit from it today, so we could still keep spreading that gospel message and have an impact in missions today. And so throughout the history of the church, Bible translation has played a critical role in the transmission of the gospel. And this all started with the Jewish people in the intertestamental period. Now, whether it be the Jews in the intertestamental period, which is the period between the Old and New Testament, now the scriptures, when they're translated into the language of the people, it's been an invaluable tool to pass along the gospel. And as most of us know, Jesus gives a command to His apostles at the end of Matthew, Mark, and at the beginning of Acts. Now this command became known as the Great Commission. And it's Christ's command to go to all nations to teach the gospel. And throughout the history of the early church, the scriptures played a crucial and pivotal role in missionary activity and evangelization. Now, when it comes to Bible translation, especially during the period we're talking about, which is from 100 to 500 AD, I think it's wise to look at the effects that the Septuagint had on the process. And then what I want to do is look at the significance of the translations that were done into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin, and how they're still significant today. Now, whatever the precise number of languages there may be, it's really surprising that by 600 AD, the four Gospels had been translated into only a few languages. Now, those languages were Latin and Gothic in the West, and Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, and Sogdian in the East. That's Sogdian. Now, if we're talking about translation, Bible translation from AD 100 to 500, I know it kind of sounds strange to talk about the Septuagint. For those that don't know, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, and it was done before Christ's birth. However, looking at the translation of the Septuagint, I think it's really important because it's like a prelude to what's going to come later on in history. The Septuagint laid the groundwork for Bible translation in the vernacular, in the common language of the people. The most important and influential translation of Scripture ever made was the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Now, the Septuagint came about because the Jewish people, they were dispersed, meaning they were no longer in Israel. They had gone somewhere in Egypt. They were in other countries as well. And as a result, some became Hellenized, and they no longer spoke or read Hebrew. Now, Koine Greek, which is the language that the New Testament was written in, was the language at the time. And so legend has it that 72 Jewish scholars met at the court named Ptolemy for a period of 72 days, and that was in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, it not only allowed Jews outside of Palestine to read the Jewish scriptures in a language that they were familiar with, but it had a really, really huge impact on the writers of the New Testament. I mean, this influence, as much as some will try to disregard it, is crucial. Whether one considers its fidelity to the original, its influence over the Jews, which is who it was prepared for, it stands preeminent in the light it casts on the study of the Scriptures. The Septuagint, out of all the Old Testament quotations in the Old Testament, several of them are from the Septuagint version. So it's very important to consider. Now, the New Testament was remarkable in that it was written in Koine Greek, which was the dialect understood by the common people in the Roman Empire. Now, this, along with people evangelizing, led to Christianity spreading far and actually very fast as well. It would reach so far that by the 2nd century there was a need for translation in the Syriac language. And this occurred when Christianity began to spread east from Antioch. And we see that very early as well, just in the book of Acts, very early on in the Christian church. Now, though most of the population in Antioch spoke Greek, there were other parts of Syria where they did not speak Greek. Now, this was problematic from an evangelism standpoint. Now, though the church was perfectly able to speak orally, having the scriptures in a local language allowed for easier transmission and copying. Now, the Syriac language, it's an offshoot of Aramaic and emerged around Edessa in the 1st century. Now, this is significant because Edessa is also known as the only center of Christian life where the language of the community was other than Greek. So pretty important. Syriac became the preferred language for Christians in eastern Syria, Persia, which is modern-day Iran, Mesopotamia, and later India, China, and Mongolia. This is a huge range. It's an incredible range which covers great mileage in Asia and the Middle East. Now, this is no coincidence. This is no coincidence as the two mission-driven churches thrived in the area. This was the language of the Jacobite and Nestorian churches, the most active missional movements in the East throughout the early church period. The Syriac version also became an innovator with how the Gospels were presented. Now, like our translations today, the Greek had the 4 Gospels as separate books. Now, in the 2nd century, the Syrian theologian Tatian combined the Gospels into one volume, into one harmonious volume. This became known as the diatessaron, which is a musical term for harmony. It was an influential work, as we see from the early church historian Eusebius, who wrote, quote, "Their former leader, however, Tatian, arranged a kind of joining together and compilation of the Gospels. I know not how, to which he gave the title diatessaron, and it is still to this day to be found in the hands of some." And this was Eusebius wrote in the 300s. Now, whether it was written in Greek and translated, or written in Syriac from the start, I mean, that's a matter of debate. What we do know is that the Syriac Christians were reading the scriptures in their own language, and that led to a huge boom in Christianity in the region. and its harmony of the Gospels had its naysayers, it had its opponents, but the results were great, and the Diatessaron was read widely until it was abolished in 423. The Syriac translation also has a legacy of being the earliest translation of the New Testament. Its influence would be felt for centuries to come, as other versions were highly influenced by the Syriac translation. Now, if the Septuagint was the most influential translation of Scripture ever produced, then the Latin translation, in my opinion, has to be a very, very, very close second. I mean, barely edged out by the Septuagint. Now, there were many Latin translations around, but the most popular became known as the Vulgate, which means the language of the people. Its influence was so immense that it was named the official translation of the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent. So what of the Latin translation's origins? Where did it originate? Now, contrary to what some may think, it did not originate with the early church father, St. Jerome. It was actually a very early translation in church history and probably started around the second century, maybe even the early 3rd century. The versions prior to the Vulgate are known as the Old Latin and helped spread Christianity in parts of the world where Greek was no longer prominent. And though Latin was a major language in the Roman Empire, the Latin versions did not originate in Rome. The language used by the Church of Rome was Greek until the mid-3rd century. The Old Latin versions would not have originated there, but in those early Christian communities that used Latin. Now, this most likely occurred in North Africa, as Greek was not widely used at the time in that region. There were some problems. The Old Latin was plagued with a bunch of textual issues. The differences were huge, they were immense. These manuscripts not only varied in literary style, but also the quality of the translation. You see, they weren't translated by one individual or by a committee. History has shown that church fathers in North Africa, such as Tertullian and Cyprian, used different language on the same passages. Now, since one finds numerous and far-reaching differences between quotations of the same passages, it's obvious that there was no uniform reading. Some books were apparently translated a number of times, and no single translator worked on all the books. Now, even though there were issues, the translation came about because of a need for the scriptures in the vernacular. And again, vernacular just means the language of the people, the common language. Now, Greek fell by the wayside and was no longer used in North Africa, but Latin was the language of the masses. It was the language of the Roman Empire. Someone took it upon themselves to start translating. Now, this may have happened during times of worship, because in worship assemblies in the late 2nd century, the Greek scriptures were read with a simultaneous line-by-line translation into Latin, probably followed by facilitating understanding in the common language. Now, the variant readings that were out there, the different versions, were causing issues, and they became an issue. And the church fathers, such as St. Augustine, they were getting really concerned about this, as they should be. Now, this concern was shared by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who was known as Damasus. And Damasus had a scholarly secretary named Sophronius Eusebius Hieronymus. We know him as St. Jerome, probably the greatest Hebrew and Greek scholar of the early church. Pope Damasus gave Jerome the duty of revising the Old Latin text. Jerome was hesitant. He was hesitant to engage in this endeavor, but he did so out of obedience to the Pope. Now, in a letter to Pope Damasus, Jerome wrote, quote, "You urge me to revise the old Latin version, and, as it were, to sit in judgment on the copies of the Scriptures which are now scattered throughout the whole world. And inasmuch as they differ from one another, you would have me decide which of them agree with the Greek original. The labor is one of love, but at the same time both perilous and presumptuous." End quote. Jerome knew that the work he would do would draw vehement criticism of some of his contemporaries. Now, St. Jerome completed this work of the Latin Vulgate, at least of the Gospels, in 385. And the rest of the Bible was completed in the early 5th century. One interesting thing Jerome did was in regard to the Old Testament. You see, instead of translating from the Septuagint, he translated from Hebrew. Now, this had a couple issues. This carried a couple issues. One was with St. Augustine, who considered the Septuagint inspired and thought the Latin should have been translated directly from it. And secondly, the Hebrew editions of the Old Testament did not have the books that would become known as the Deuterocanonical books, or some people will call them Apocrypha. Now, though Jerome did not think these books to be canonical, they were included at the request of the bishop. He would later on in his life, he would actually change his mind and say that they were canonical. Nevertheless, the Vulgate would change the face of Christianity, change the face of Christendom, and it served to help evangelize multitudes of people. Now, though the Latin translation may have originated in northern Africa, Latin itself was used through a majority of the Roman Empire. This helped the Vulgate gain acceptance as the people were able to understand it, even if they weren't able to read. The Vulgate helped to establish Latin as the primary language of worship in the West. Now, this version of the Scripture stood the test of time and was used for over 1,000 years. Now, it deeply affected the theology of the Catholic Church, and both Protestants and Catholics share the words that were made popular by St. Jerome. These words include regeneration, salvation, sanctification, propitiation, reconciliation, and inspiration. All words that were unheard of before Jerome's translation. All of Christendom is indebted to this translation, and for the many souls that it helped save and enter into their eternal rest. So how about Coptic? We hear about Coptic. We hear about the Coptic Christians. Now, Coptic was the morphing of the ancient Egyptian language. Egyptian Christians wrote the native language using 24 Greek letters, with the addition of 7 signs taken over from a more cursive variety of Egyptian Demotic to express sounds that did not exist in spoken Greek. So they were using kind of a mixture of Greek and like their own ancient language and kind of combining those to make Coptic. Coptic is almost entirely religious in nature. I mean, it's not a language that people were out speaking. It was only used for religious purposes. And many Greek words that were used to explain doctrine derive from it. Now, this can be seen from the early church father Athanasius, and that contributes to our understanding of the Trinity when he squared off against Arius at the Council of Nicaea. Coptic was developed in an attempt to differentiate Christianity from the pagan views of ancient Egypt. Now, it's unknown who developed it, but it may have been an oral tradition that was later written down. That's what most scholars think. There are 6 dialects of Coptic, actually. Sahidic, Baharic, Ecumenic, Sub-Ecumenic, Middle Egyptian, and Fayumic. Now, translation started in Coptic because of a need to have a vernacular translation. There's a common theme here if you catch on to it. The need of Scripture in Coptic was derived from a missional focus, people trying to obey Jesus' command of the Great Commission. It was needed to evangelize and disciple. In other words, the Great Commission was being obeyed, but Coptic was needed to disciple new converts in the Christian faith. Now, like some of the other translations we've talked about, it underwent revision as the church in Egypt grew. Coptic was so entrenched in church life that it remained the language of the church even after Arabic became the official language. The Coptic scriptures were important to the spread of the church in Egypt. It came about because of a need to teach the people the faith, and Coptic was used for several hundred years, and in some parts of Egypt, it's still used today. As far as evangelizing goes, different translations of the Bible to the vernacular have been critical. They've been critical to evangelization. They've been critical to missions. History has shown that when the scriptures are presented and the people, when the scriptures are presented in a language that the people have, there'll be more conversions and disciples being made. And so what I've done during the course of this show to answer Andrew's question is give an overview of Syriac, Latin, and Coptic translations. All three translations have something in common. They were developed with the need to evangelize and disciple in mind. They were not translated so someone could have a copy, but they were translated for the people. The translators of these early versions understood the importance of having translation in the vernacular. It made the gospel easier to proclaim and made the faith easier to teach. Basically, in short, these translations, the scriptures, are the foundations of missions. The Bible has been translated into many languages, including Latin, German, English, and other places that Christians went. The importance of Bible translation in missions can be seen from the beginning of the church. The Syriac translation was the first to translate the Greek New Testament to a vernacular language. The Assyrian church used the version in its missionary activities and were able to spread the gospel message as far as China. You see, as human beings, we have an innate need to verify information that we are given. Having a translation in our own language allows someone to verify what they're being told. It allows them to personalize it and lets them know that the gospel is something that is accessible. The gospel is thus seen to be one, yet diverse. It is given, yet culturally adapted to its audience. The message of the Bible is one that is for all people. It's universal and is understood in any language. God made us. He loves us in spite of our rebellious attitude toward Him, and He wants to reconcile us to Himself. This is what the role of the Bible translation has done. It has shown a people in their own language the message and beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The translations that we've gone over, Syriac, Latin, and Coptic, changed the world because they helped expand Christianity all over the known world. Now, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Hope Within. I know it's a bit of a history lesson, but when it comes to our heritage as Christians, I think all too often we forget our history. And as the old saying goes, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. A lot of people get upset about different translations of the Bible, but there's still people groups out there that don't have a translation in their own language. And so what I wanted to do, in addition to answering Andrew's question, was to emphasize the importance that having the Bible in one's own language has played throughout Christian history. And I hope I've done that. We saw that with Latin, which was the main language of the Roman Empire. As much as people don't like to say Latin, Latin was instrumental. And back then, if you couldn't read Latin, and this was going all the way back to the 1500s, if you couldn't read Latin, you just flat out couldn't read. We see that with Syriac, we see that with Coptic, other languages as well, Armenian, etc. Having a Bible translation in one's own language has been instrumental. Let us not waver in that. There's still people out there in languages that don't have a copy of the scriptures. And yeah, they're being taught orally, which is great. We need to keep doing that. but I think sometimes we make a big deal because I'll be honest, there's a plethora of English translations. There's probably a little too many because every publishing house wants to get their penny's worth and have a copyright, but a lot of languages don't have their own copy. Let's remember how blessed we are to have a translation, to have all these translations in English. Guys, Hope Within is listener supported. If you want to donate to the show, please do at PayPal. My PayPal ID is william.hemsworth. That's HEMSWORTH @gmail.com. And as always, visit my website, theologystillmatters.com. You can check out back episodes, and my Amazon author page is there as well. God bless you guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Hope Within. Enjoy the rest of your week. God bless you.